The cold was unnatural, even for a world at the edge of segmentum obscurus. As our Valkyrie descended toward the surface of Glacis 9, the wind tore at our armor with a ferocity I have never before witnessed. Sergeant Marius Corps reporting, landing party of the 142nd Cadian Regiment, disembarking under conditions that defy standard atmospheric readings. Instruments fluctuate violently. Temperature readings oscillate between -72 and -62 degrees without pattern. The snow is wrong. Patches of it swallow boots, heavy as liquid yet solid beneath the heel, pulling men downward with a force that is almost sentient. Corporal Vesh disappeared in one such pocket before the ramp even touched the frost-crusted ground. The mining station loomed ahead, its structure jagged and tilted, as though the ice beneath had shifted and contorted it over centuries. Comms reports had warned of silence, but silence is a lie here. Beneath the wind's howl, there was something else, a faint, metallic groan, a resonance from deep within the ice that vibrated through our boots, our armor, our very bones. It was not the sound of the station settling. It was deliberate. We moved in disciplined formation, squads at 30-meter intervals, laser guns ready. The landscape was fractured, ridges of crimson ice marred the white expanse. Blood or mineral? I cannot tell. My training tells me to catalog, to observe, to report. My mind screams otherwise. Sergeant, sir, Private Kellen's voice crackled over comms. He paused. There's footprints leading toward the fissure, but they vanish, I acknowledged with a clipped response. No sign of panicking, even as my own chest tightened. We crossed the fissure. My boot nearly sank into it before it held. I marked the coordinates on a 12 sector for procedural completeness. The anomaly was spreading, subtle but insidious. The station doors were frozen shut. Thermal scanners detected faint heat signatures inside, human in shape, though no life signs registered. I ordered a squad to breach via charge, careful not to disturb what might be a mechanism, a trap, or something else. The doors shuddered under the explosive charge, the metal screaming as it yielded. Inside, the air was stale, tinged with iron and something sweet, almost like decay fermented. Pipes groaned, dripping condensation that froze mid-fall. Instruments fluctuated again. The logs from the station, if they exist, had been wiped or overwritten. Yet faint, illegible scribbles on walls suggested past occupancy, a numbering system gone wrong or deliberately scrambled. We moved forward. My helmet HUD caught fleeting figures at the edge of perception, shadows that didn't align with physical objects. I blinked, recalibrated, but they remained, just outside clarity, pulsing at the edges of my vision. "Keep tight," I said, though I feared the sound of my own voice. At the command center, the comms terminal sparked, briefly coming to life. A voice, a soldier I recognized from earlier patrols, came through, distorted and repeating a string of numbers. 15, 17, 0, 33, recalibrate, recalibrate. Then silence. I scrawled the sequence in my log. The anomaly is now talking through them. Corporal Vesh, still missing from the snow pocket, appeared in the doorway. Not as he should be. His movements were jerky, as if two motors operated him at once. He opened his mouth. No words came, only a gurgling harmonic resonance that seemed to match the vibration under the station floor. The squad stepped back, weapons raised, but I froze. The sound was calling to something beneath the ice. A low tremor rattled the floor. Instruments went dead. The lights flickered. I could feel the station shifting as if alive, as if acknowledging our presence. Fall back, I thought, but orders are orders. I logged everything meticulously. Temperature fluctuation, anomalous gravity pockets, auditory phenomena, the irregular behavior of personnel, and, most importantly, the creeping sensation that we were being observed by something vast and deliberate. I ordered the squad to the southern corridor. A faint light flickered beneath a sealed hatch. The resonance intensified. I approached it, laser gun ready, but my hand trembled. The ice beneath seemed to pulse, subtly, like a heartbeat. A whisper, impossibly human yet alien, tickled the edge of my mind. "Enter." We paused. Instruments went completely blank. The hatch creaked, as if opening by itself, a thin sheet of frost sliding aside. The smell of iron and decay intensified. My comms crackled again. The missing soldier's voice returned, clearer this time, but fragmented. "Beneath! Beneath!" Then static. We exchanged glances. No one moved, yet no one could look away. The anomaly beneath the ice was waking. The first frostbitten screams tore through the corridor. Private Kellen and 2 others disappeared into the floor itself, leaving only frozen footprints behind, vanishing as if they had never existed. I documented every detail, my voice steady despite my chest burning with adrenaline and fear. "This is Glacis 9. The ice is not ice. The station is not inert. We are not alone. And beneath us something waits." As we descended further into the southern corridor, the floor pulsed beneath my boots once more. The hatch slid fully open, revealing a staircase carved directly into crimson ice. I stepped forward, and the whispers followed. "Sergeant Marius Corps, continuing transmission. Coordinates logged. Glacis 9 Primary Mining Complex, Southern Access Corridor. Entry date. Redacted for Imperial classification. The station's interior swallowed us like a mausoleum. Our boots crunched on frost-coated steel. Every step echoed unnaturally, carrying further than it should, bouncing back with distortions. I ordered Vox discipline, but silence only worsened the dread. The walls themselves seemed to hum, and a rhythmic vibration that resonated in my chest cavity. We reached the first junction. The station's automatic lights flickered as if powered by a failing generator, though my auspex reported steady energy flow. Corporal Wren knelt to examine a console. "Power draw constant, Sergeant. Systems are mimicking failure." Mimicking, his choice of word, not mine. I noted it, though the implication lodged in my skull like ice. We pressed on. Blood trails appeared, thin streaks across the floor, vanishing into walls where no seams existed. Private Helna swore she heard something breathing inside the steel plating. I rebuked her, demanded focus, yet I too caught a subtle rasp when I leaned close. Not airflow, not machinery. Something damp, strained, alive. We breached the first storage bay. Its doors resisted, sealed by layers of ice, but a thermal lance cut through. The chamber beyond was vast, filled with crates stacked in regimented rows, but several had burst open. Tools floated in the air, not drifting like zero-gravity debris, but hovering at fixed intervals. Spanners, drills, mining charges, all suspended in uncanny equilibrium. "Emperor preserve us," Wren muttered. He reached to touch one. It shifted slightly, as though aware, tilting toward his hand. I barked at him to pull back. None of us dared disturb the arrangement further. In the far corner, a Vox unit clicked to life without power. A whisper slid from the speaker, indistinct, then sharpened. "Cold, cold, beneath." It repeated 3 times before cutting into static. My HUD registered no transmission source. We advanced deeper. Environmental hazards grew stranger. Shadows moved opposite their owners. The squad's torch beams fractured, splitting into multiple shafts of pale light, scattering in impossible geometry. At one point, my beam illuminated Helna from 3 different angles, though I was directly in front of her. She turned pale, muttering litanies to the God Emperor. At subsection Delta, we found signs of habitation. Bunks, personal effects, ration packs, all abandoned mid-use. One cup still half filled, its contents frozen solid. No bodies, no sign of struggle. But the walls here bore marks. Crude etchings scratched by desperate hands. Numbers repeated in irregular sequences. 17, 33, 0, 15. They matched fragments of the broadcast from earlier. I touched the wall. My glove pressed against the etched numerals, and for a moment the steel yielded. Not warm, not liquid, but pliant, like flesh straining against bone. I recoiled, issuing order for no direct contact with surfaces. But my men had already seen. Fear eroded discipline. The vox crackled again. Corporal Vesh's voice, though he had vanished into the snow, echoed across all channels. I see you. I see you in the dark. The dark beneath his tone was wrong. No breath between words, flat, mechanical cadence. My squad froze, listening until Wren shouted over comms, demanding location. Silence answered. Then came the scream. Not through vox, but echoing through the corridor itself. Human, raw, stretched until it warped into something else. It came from below us. Every man turned downward, staring at the frost-caked floor as if the sound were rising through it. I logged anomaly escalation. A decision point. Advance toward source or withdraw. Orders demanded full investigation. I chose advance. We reached a secondary stairwell leading down. The air temperature dropped sharply. Frost thickened into layers resembling muscle fibers, striated and pulsating faintly with the vibrations. Lights dimmed, replaced by faint crimson luminescence leaking from cracks in the ice. At the base of the stair, a door hung half open. A trail of frozen blood led through. Beyond, we entered what must once have been the miners' chapel. Benches overturned, altar cracked. The aquila defaced. But the defacement was peculiar. Not vandalism, but rewriting. The aquila's wings had been etched over with elongated geometric patterns, like crystalline growths. The holy icon had been consumed, not destroyed. My men whispered litanies under their breath. I did the same. Faith held the line, if only barely. Then Wren cried out. He stood rigid, pointing at the far wall. A shadow moved there, independent of us, tall and elongated. It lingered, watching. Then it stepped backward into the wall and vanished. The vox chimed again, this time multiple voices, overlapping. The missing miners, the missing guardsmen, perhaps others, all repeating the same numbers in different tones. 17, 0, 33, 15. Their cadence formed a rhythm, like a chant. My helmet HUD glitched. For a split second, the numbers appeared across my display, seared in bright crimson, before vanishing. The squad broke formation. Helena clutched her head, screaming that the numbers were inside her skull. Two others stumbled backward, raising laser guns at shadows. I forced them back into line, barked orders with all the authority left in me, but discipline frays in the presence of the impossible. The resonance beneath the floor intensified. The very station seemed to breathe. Frost fell like ash from the ceiling, coating our armor in red-tinted snowflakes. I ended the log here, because at that moment, I saw something I cannot reconcile. At the far end of the chapel, a body stood upright against the wall. Not hung, not propped, embedded. Flesh fused into steel, face contorted in silent agony. Its eyes followed us. Its lips trembled, mouthing numbers we could not hear. Then the lights cut out. Darkness absolute. My men cried out, weapons sparking red beams into void. And in that pitch black, the vox whispered, soft as breath against my ear, "We are not beneath. You are." The station shuddered. Somewhere below, metal screamed like a living throat. Sergeant Marius Corps, continuing record. Southern Chapel, Glacis 9 mining station. After the blackout, we advanced with helmet lamps only. Each beam carved thin wounds of light into suffocating dark. The vox hissed with low static, no signal reception beyond 20 meters. I ordered a breach on the chapel's subhatch. It resisted, its hinges clogged with layers of crimson frost, but finally gave way with a shriek like tearing sinew. A gust of air escaped. Impossible in a sealed station, laden with rot, damp, and something faintly sweet, like spoiled fruit. The men gagged. The stairwell descended steeply into ice. Not natural formations. Every surface bore the marks of chisels and drills. Yet the shapes were wrong. Steps warped in inconsistent intervals. Some narrow as a boot, others stretched wider than a man's stride. Depth perception faltered. I marked it in my log. Anomalous geometry, potential warp contamination. At the base, the passage opened into a cavern. My breath caught. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of miners stood frozen in place. Not scattered, not collapsed mid-flight, arranged. Each corpse was encased in translucent ice, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide. Their arms extended, fingers bent unnaturally, all pointing toward a central altar carved from raw crimson crystal. My squad faltered. Private Helna whispered prayers. Corporal Wren dropped to one knee, retching into his rebreather. The sight defied human order. I advanced, my lamp beam sweeping over faces locked in eternal terror. Frost covered them like burial shrouds, yet faint light refracted through their bodies. And then, I heard it. A sound. At first I thought it was the wind, a faint susurrus that grew into rhythmic whispers. But as we approached the altar, the truth revealed itself. The miners' throats were not still. Their frozen mouths emitted sound, a choir of whispers so faint that only the silence allowed them to be heard. 15, 33, recalibrate, beneath. I ordered the squad to hold formation. None obeyed. Each man turned his lamp toward a different corpse, as if hypnotized. Wren stepped closer, his face inches from one frozen miner. "It's alive," he murmured. "It's trying to—" The corpse's lips twitched. Its jaw shifted within the ice, cracking frost around its chin. Wren screamed and fell backward. We raised weapons, but I hesitated. Las fire might ignite volatile gases. Discipline warred with dread. I chose discipline. The altar drew my attention. Its surface pulsed faintly, veins of light moving like liquid through solid crystal. Symbols etched into it flickered between languages. High Gothic one moment, Binharic code the next, then shifting to unrecognizable glyphs. My mind struggled to read them, each glance leaving behind an afterimage in my skull. I reached to record the inscriptions, but the vox blared suddenly. Not static. Song. A broken hymn, multiple voices layered. Familiar, yet wrong. The Imperial creed fractured, inverted. The Emperor is beneath. The light is frost. The blood is glass. The sound pierced us. Helna clutched her ears, shrieking. 2 guardsmen dropped weapons, convulsing as the hymn scraped their minds raw. I grabbed Wren, forced him back to his feet. "Eyes forward, soldier! Form the line!" But then, the corpses moved. Not in unison, but in subtle jerks. An arm twitched. A head lolled. Ice cracked as joints strained. Each miner remained frozen in place, yet the choir's volume swelled as though breath had returned to their lungs. The whispers merged into resonance. Our auspexes lit with impossible readings, seismic vibrations without tectonic movement, heat spikes within frozen bodies, and beneath it all, the pulse. The floor itself throbbed like a buried heart. I logged every detail through clenched teeth. My men needed faith. If they could not have hope, they would have duty. "Squad, advance," I ordered. We stepped toward the altar. Every pace deepened the resonance, until our chest cavities vibrated with the choir's hum. Our helmet lamps flickered, bending into spirals of refracted light. At the altar's base lay a Mechanicus servo skull, long inert. Its vox emitter still functioned, replaying a fragmentary log. "Containment breach. Crystal, not natural mineral. We are not mining. We are harvested." Then silence, replaced by a shriek so shrill it cracked the vox grill. Corporal Wren whispered, "We have to destroy it." Before I could respond, the ice floor split. A fissure tore through the cavern, bisecting frozen corpses. Red frost spilled upward in a geyser. One body fell, cracking open, flesh within glistening wet, despite centuries entombed. Its jaw tore fully open, and from its throat came not a scream, but a chant. Beneath, beneath, beneath. The choir answered in unison. My men panicked. Las fire erupted across the cavern, beams striking frozen bodies. The ice refracted light wildly, scattering crimson rays in chaotic brilliance. The effect was blinding, disorienting. Shadows danced as if alive, and the resonance became deafening. I shouted for ceasefire, but my voice drowned beneath the hymn. The fissure widened. The altar pulsed brighter, its veins synchronizing with the choir's rhythm. I swear the crystal breathed. Then, in the chaos, something impossible happened. The frozen corpses began to point. Not randomly, synchronously. Every arm raised, fingers extending toward the southern wall of the cavern. Their frozen joints cracked, breaking in unnatural angles, yet still they pointed. My lamp beam followed. The southern wall shimmered. Not ice, not steel. Something between opaque yet translucent. Shapes moved beyond it, distorted, enormous. Private Helena fell to her knees, sobbing prayers. Ren dropped his weapon entirely, backing away. There's something behind it, he muttered. It's watching us. The wall pulsed once, just once. A ripple across its surface, and the choir fell silent. The sudden absence of sound was worse than the hymn. Our breathing thundered in the void. Then, soft, almost intimate, came a whisper. Not from Vox, not from any one direction, but from inside my skull. Enter. The southern wall cracked. A seam formed, thin at first, then widening into a passage carved into crimson ice. I steadied my weapon, forcing words through a throat like stone. Formation, we proceed. My men hesitated. None wanted to move. I did not blame them, but orders remain orders. We advanced toward the breach. Behind us, I swear the frozen choir began to breathe. The year was 1872, and the village of Withers Hollow had changed little since the first whispers of the curse. The church still stood tall and brooding at the edge of the graveyard, its steeple casting a long shadow across the uneven stones. The earth of the Withers children's plots had been disturbed so many times that the soil looked different, darker, looser, as though it could never quite settle. For years, the villagers had tried to move past the dread that clung to the name Withers, but each disturbance dragged them back into the spiral of fear. Some swore they heard scratching beneath the soil on moonless nights, while others whispered that the cries of children sometimes drifted through the fog that rolled from the nearby river. And so it was that when the bodies surfaced once more, this time in a manner more horrifying than before, the town was forced to gather again. The unearthing. On the morning of April the 3rd, a farmhand named Elias trudged through the churchyard carrying tools. His family had been tasked with clearing weeds from around the graves, but when he reached the Withers plots, his spade struck something solid, not stone, but wood. The ground had shifted again. The coffins of the Withers children, which had been buried deep only 2 winters ago, lay half exposed. Elias dropped his spade, breath catching in his throat. The coffins were open. Inside, the remains of the Withers children stared back at him, or what remained of them. Their bones had been arranged unnaturally, their skulls turned toward the surface, jaws parted in a ghastly grin. But it was not rot or decay that unsettled Elias most. It was the fact that soil clung to the inside of the coffins, pressed into the bones as though the children had clawed their way upward once again. The farmhand stumbled back, running to raise the alarm. By midday, half the village stood clustered around the opened graves, their faces pale, their voices low. 13 times, the priest whispered, his hand trembling over his rosary. 13 times they have risen. Why will the earth not take them? The ritual. The town elders, desperate and weary, declared that this would be the final reburial. Ordinary burial rites had failed. Consecrated ground had failed. Even the hammering of iron nails through the coffins, an old superstition meant to hold spirits down, had not succeeded. That night, under the dim light of lanterns, the villagers performed a ritual unlike any before. The coffins were carried once more to freshly dug graves, this time at the farthest edge of the cemetery, away from consecrated ground. The priest muttered Latin prayers, his voice breaking while others recited older incantations, words taken from the whispers of grandmothers who remembered darker traditions. Salt was poured over the remains. Ashes from burned yew wood were scattered. And when the children were lowered into the ground for the 13th time, iron chains were wrapped across the coffins, padlocked shut before the soil covered them once more. Still, no one left with peace in their heart. The curse deepens. After the 13th burial, strange events began to unfold in Wither's Hollow. Livestock were found dead in their pens, their bodies arranged unnaturally, echoing the twisted posture of the Wither's remains. Infants in the village cried at odd hours, as though responding to a sound only they could hear. And then came the dreams. Villagers reported visions of pale children standing at their bedside, their hollow eyes fixed upon them. Some awoke with soil beneath their fingernails, as though they had been digging in their sleep. Others heard faint laughter outside their windows, though when they looked, nothing stirred but the trees. It became clear. The 13th burial had not ended the curse. It had deepened it. The record keeper among those disturbed was Margaret Ellison, the daughter of the town's record keeper. She found herself drawn to the graveyard nightly, compelled by whispers only she could hear. Her father, fearing for her soul, locked her inside their home after she was caught standing barefoot in the churchyard, staring at the Wither's graves, lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps in mimicry of something else. Margaret began keeping a journal of her dreams. She wrote of children beckoning her into the earth, promising that if she joined them, she would never be alone again. Her last entry, written the night before she vanished, contained only 6 words. The 13th is never the last. The next morning, Margaret was gone. Only her journal remained, lying open on her bed. Some said she had run away. Others believed she had been taken by the Wither's children. When the graveyard was searched, no new disturbances were found. But the chains upon the Wither's coffins were no longer tight. They had been loosened, as though by small hands working from within. The silence that followed. After Margaret's disappearance, the town grew silent about the Wither's curse. Records of the events grew scarce, whispers replaced with uneasy silence. Families who could afford to move away did so. Those who stayed avoided the graveyard at all costs, letting weeds overrun the stones. But old stories linger. Even now, some claim that on stormy nights, the sound of children laughing can be heard near the Wither's graves. Others believe that the 13th reburial was not the end, but the beginning of something darker, something that would reach far beyond the borders of Wither's Hollow. For curses such as these are not contained by soil, nor by chains, nor even by silence. And so the story waits, patient, restless, as though the Wither's children are listening still. The air was bitter on the morning of the 13th burial. Clouds hung low, heavy as lead, and the hills around Las Cruces felt suffocated under a silence that was more than natural. People said even the wind had grown wary of passing through the Wither's land. By now, the townsfolk were weary. 13 burials for the same children, the same coffins lowered, the same hymns sung, the same earth disturbed again and again. Yet still, the graves never held. Within days, sometimes hours, the soil would shift, collapse, or split wide. On occasion, the children's coffins surfaced entirely, as if spat out by the ground itself. It had become a ritual of dread, a cycle no one could understand, but which no one dared refuse. This time, the procession was smaller. Many who had attended the first burials no longer came. Fear hollowed out their faith. Some said the land was cursed. Others whispered of older things, that the Withers bloodline had wronged something not of this world. Only the most devout, the most desperate, still followed the family to the cemetery on the ridge. The graves had been dug deeper this time. Men swore and bled with their shovels, cutting through rock and root to carve out holes so profound they seemed to scrape at the mantle of the earth itself. This time, they said, the ground will keep them. But even as the coffins were lowered, a sense of futility hung over the mourners. A local priest, his hands trembling, recited prayers that faltered into silence. His voice cracked when he reached the final words, as if he feared the sound of his own blessing. Some of the townsfolk looked away. That night, the storm began. Rain fell in sheets, pounding the dry earth into black sludge. Lightning split the desert sky, and thunder rolled like the voice of something ancient, something that had not forgotten. At dawn, when the storm eased, the townsfolk returned to the cemetery. The graves were open. Again. The soil had been churned and scattered, the coffins cracked and rising through the mud as though the earth had spit them up whole. A smell lingered. Iron, damp wood, and something older, like rot from beneath the desert crust. The priest broke first. Dropping to his knees in the muck, he cried out that the Withers children were not meant to rest, that their reburials mocked the natural order. Others joined in, wailing, clutching at their beads and crosses. But some stayed silent, their faces pale, their eyes hard. They were remembering stories from before New Mexico was New Mexico, of spirits in the land, of bloodlines cursed by their own stubborn refusal to die. By evening, men with shotguns guarded the ridge, swearing no further disturbance would come. But deep down, everyone knew. The 13th burial was no different than the first. The earth had rejected them again. And now, the whispers began in earnest. That the Withers children were not at rest because they were not entirely dead. That the desert itself had marked their bloodline, binding them to something beyond human comprehension. And that each failed burial was not a mistake, but a warning. For days after the 13th reburial, Las Cruces lived in a state of suspended dread. The townsfolk still went about their routines, fetching water, tending to fields, mending fences, but all with the restless glance of prey, listening for a predator. It was not just the failed burials anymore. Something else had begun to spread. It started with the dreams. A farmer's wife confessed to waking in the dead of night, dirt beneath her fingernails and the taste of earth in her mouth. Another woman claimed she heard children laughing outside her window when no child was near. Men in the saloon spoke in hushed voices of nightmares in which the Withers children stood at the foot of their beds, mud dripping from their small hands, their eyes pale and unblinking. The priest, broken by the 13th failure, had locked himself away in the rectory. When one parishioner forced the door, they found him scribbling scripture over and over, but the letters twisted, distorted, barely resembling holy words. When asked what he was doing, he said only, "They whisper from beneath the soil. They do not sleep. They will never sleep." At the Withers homestead, the family suffered worse than anyone. Their livestock sickened and died within a week. Horses refused to approach the barn, eyes rolling back, hooves striking the dirt in terror. The mother, pale and haggard, said she could still hear her children calling for her, sometimes from the ridge, sometimes from under the floorboards of their own house. But the most disturbing account came from a gravedigger named Elias. He had been among those tasked with the 13th burial, one of the men who swore the graves would be the deepest yet. One night, drunk and trembling, Elias confessed in the saloon what he had seen when he leaned too close to the open pit. There was movement, he said, voice cracked, not from the storm, not from roots or worms. It was the soil itself, breathing, swelling in and out like lungs. And when the lightning struck, for just a moment, I saw faces in the dirt, small, round, pressed into the earth, children's faces, The saloon went silent. No one laughed, no one mocked him, because too many had seen things themselves, though they dared not speak. From that night on, no man would dig again on the ridge. The cemetery lay abandoned, coffins half sunk in muck, the ground restless as if it hated what had been forced into it. Some of the older folk began whispering of the land itself. They remembered stories from the Mescalero Apache, warnings that certain stretches of desert were not to be disturbed, sacred ground, bound by things older than men. They spoke of places where the earth swallowed the dead and refused to give them back, places where the boundary between life and death thinned until it tore. But the Withers family had not listened. They had buried their children again and again into soil that did not want them. Now the whole town was paying the price. On the last night of August, a cry tore through the darkness. The Withers' mother had vanished from her bed. Neighbors searched the house, the barn, the hills, until someone thought to climb the ridge. There she was, kneeling before her children's disturbed graves. Her arms were sunk elbow deep into the soil, fingers clawing through the mud as if searching for something. Her eyes were open, but she did not see those who approached. Her lips moved in broken whispers. "They're calling me. They're calling me home." When they pulled her back, her fingernails were gone, torn away in the frantic digging. Beneath her nails, packed tight, was not earth but flesh, gray, wet, and unrotted. That was the night the townsfolk stopped asking why the graves rejected the children, and started asking what it was that lay beneath them. The silence that followed the Withers' mother's breakdown was heavier than the desert air itself. Neighbors, who once kept watch in uneasy solidarity, began to avoid the ridge altogether. Doors were locked before sundown. Windows were shuttered, not against thieves or wild animals, but against the unseen things that pressed too close in the dark. Still, it was impossible to escape what had begun. The whispers beneath the soil had grown bolder. Where once they came only at night, they now seeped into daylight. Farmhands plowing the dry fields claimed to hear faint laughter drifting across the wind. Children who should have been alive, their laughter high and sweet, yet it carried no joy. The blacksmith's apprentice swore he heard a girl singing near the river. When he followed, he found no footprints, only a wet scrap of cloth half buried in the mud. It matched the dress of one of the Withers girls. She had been buried weeks ago. Every sign was a warning, but the town had reached the threshold of something worse. The night of the knocket began in the Withers' home. The father, gaunt, hollow-eyed, drinking himself into oblivion most nights, was awakened by a knock on the door just past midnight. Slow, gentle, like a child who had come home after wandering too far. 3 knocks, then silence. His wife stirred, clutching his arm. "Don't answer," she whispered, but the sound came again. Louder this time. 4 knocks, patient, rhythmic. The father, exhausted beyond reason, dragged himself from the bed. His hand shook as he reached for the lantern. He opened the door. No one stood on the porch, but there were small footprints in the dust, bare feet, leading from the ridge, across the yard, up to his very doorstep. He slammed the door shut, bolted it, and swore he would not speak of it. But the story leaked out, as all stories in small towns do, and when others began to hear knocks at their own doors, always at night, always soft, always at child's height, they could no longer deny it. The schoolhouse incident. The first true sighting came weeks later, in the old schoolhouse. Miss Parker, the school teacher, was closing up for the evening. Her students had gone, and the desert sun had long since slipped behind the jagged peaks. She moved between the rows of desks, gathering slates and chalk, humming absently to herself. That was when she heard it, the sound of children giggling. Not unusual, except the room was empty. She froze. The sound came again, from the back of the room. She turned. Her lantern's weak glow barely reached the last row of benches, But there, for just a moment, she saw them. 3 small figures, pale, gray-skinned, their clothes tattered and caked with soil, their heads tilted unnaturally to the side, as if their necks were too weak to bear the weight, their eyes, white and empty, fixed on her, and they were smiling. The lantern slipped from her grasp. Darkness swallowed the room, but not before she heard the scuffle of bare feet across the wooden floor. By the time others arrived, she was found curled in a corner, hands covering her face, rocking back and forth. She never taught another class again. The sheriff's decision. The townsfolk turned to Sheriff Harlan, demanding order. The Withers family, they said, had cursed them all by refusing to leave their children in peace. Some argued the graves should be dug up once more, this time to burn the bodies. Others said the family should be driven out entirely. But the sheriff, a pragmatic man, refused. "If we stir that ground again," he warned, "we'll only make it worse." Yet even he could not deny what was happening. His own deputy confessed to hearing voices when he patrolled the ridge. "They call my name, Sheriff," he said, trembling, "like they know me, like they've been waiting." The sheriff ordered the ridge sealed off. No one was to go near the cemetery at night. He posted men at the base of the hill, though none lasted more than a night or two before quitting. They said the air grew too heavy, the silence too sharp. Some came back pale, sweating, with stories of shapes moving just beyond the lamplight. One man refused to say anything at all, only that he would never stand near that hill again, not for all the gold in New Mexico. The Withers' father. The breaking point came when the Withers' father himself vanished. It was September 17th when his wife woke to find his side of the bed cold. His boots were gone, his rifle missing. Tracks led toward the ridge. The sheriff and a handful of men followed at dawn. They found his lantern near the first row of graves, still burning though the oil should have run dry. His boots were discovered half buried in the dirt, as if he had stepped right out of them. And then there was the grave. One of the children's coffins had been clawed open from the inside. Inside, there was no body, only earth, packed, heavy and damp, as if it had swallowed what lay there. The father was never found. Whispers become voices. After that, the haunting spread beyond the ridge. The whispers beneath the soil grew louder, clearer. No longer faint laughter or distant songs, but words, phrases. "Please, let us in. We're cold. Mother, where are you?" Windows rattled in their frames when the voices came. Doors buckled under unseen hands. Families huddled together by the fire, praying aloud, clutching rosaries, reading scripture until their throats bled dry. But the prayers brought no peace, for the children of Withers Ridge no longer belonged to God, if they ever had at all. They belonged to the soil, and the soil wanted more. The summer of 1872 had given way to a dry, suffocating autumn. The desert air hung thick over Las Cruces, carrying a heavy stillness that pressed on skin and spirit alike. The Withers children, or what remained of them, were no longer confined to their graves. They had grown bolder. The whispers had grown louder. Now they moved. The first attacks. It began on the night of October 3rd. Windows rattled as though gripped by skeletal fingers. Families woke to scratching at the doors, soft at first, then growing insistent. Footsteps, too light to be human, padded across floors. The terrified townsfolk found furniture overturned, crockery shattered, and small handprints pressed into dust and soot, streaked with the black red of desert soil. Sheriff Harlan and his deputies were summoned, but they discovered nothing. No children, no footprints in the yard outside. Yet every home they inspected bore the same marks. In the Smithson home, the youngest child, Abigail, claimed to have seen the pale faces of the Withers girls standing in her room at the foot of her bed. Their eyes were empty, but they smiled. "Come play," they said in unison. The sheriff swore he would enforce a curfew. Doors were barred, locks reinforced. But it did not matter. The children ignored physical barriers. One night, the iron bars on a window bent inward, almost liquidly, to allow a small gray hand through. The town huddles. By the fourth night, panic gripped the town. Families gathered in the town hall, bringing their children, livestock, and whatever possessions they could carry. Lanterns were lit and set on every table. The priest, pale and trembling, led prayer after prayer, litanies that he had never dared recite aloud before. Yet amid the prayers came the whispers. Not distant now, but inside every room, every heart. "We're cold," the voices said. "We want home." Those who tried to respond, calling the names of the dead children, pleading for them to leave, found their voices drowned by shrill laughter, echoing off walls, bending the shadows into impossible angles. Even the grown men and women began to see them, not just in corners or reflected in the firelight, but in the center of the hall, where no one had been before. 3, 4, 6 children, pale and covered in soil, their clothing tattered and wet, as if they had emerged from the grave itself. The mass manifestation. On the 5th night, the full manifestation occurred. Townsfolk reported hundreds of eyes watching them. Children, half-formed, their faces a grotesque mirror of the buried Withers kids. They stood on rooftops, crouched in shadows, hovered at the edges of light. Their giggles echoed in impossible directions, bouncing off walls, coming from within the bodies of those who looked at them directly. Some attempted to flee. Horses bolted in terror, wagons overturned, and lanterns went out all at once. Screams mixed with laughter, a sound so unnatural it seemed to warp the very air. Sheriff Harlan tried to rally the town, but he too faltered. He saw one child step from the shadow into the light, only to vanish as he blinked. When he raised his lantern again, a dozen children were there surrounding him, their empty eyes fixed on his face. Physical harm. The Withers children were no longer content with haunting. They reached through walls, tugged at clothing, scratched skin. Some adults reported being pulled downstairs, though no one was ever injured fatally. Bruises, scratches, small punctures. The evidence was undeniable, though still insufficient to explain the phenomenon. The town hall itself was not immune. Doors twisted on their hinges. Floorboards creaked under invisible weight. Shadows stretched across walls, sometimes forming grotesque shapes of dozens of children merging into one, limbs interlacing unnaturally. The priest, still trying to maintain order, began muttering in broken tongues, mixing the imperial creed with phrases he swore were older than the land itself. But even he could not reach the Withers children. They laughed at his rituals. Breaking point. By dawn, Las Cruces was nearly abandoned. The town hall had become a fortress. Windows were shuttered, doors reinforced with chains, yet the atmosphere remained thick with dread. Some of the older townsfolk insisted the Withers' curse could only be ended by returning the children to their rightful place in the soil, or by leaving the land entirely. Sheriff Harlan made a desperate decision. Gather all remaining townsfolk, force a retreat from Las Cruces, and leave the cemetery and ridge undisturbed. The Withers family, broken and grief-stricken, refused. They had spent 13 burials trying to contain the curse, and now they too fled in terror, leaving the town to the phenomena they had unwillingly unleashed. Lingering horror. Even as people left, these sad whispers followed them. Children saw fleeting faces in the sand, small hands waving from the hillsides. Some said that at night, in the desert beyond the town, a group of pale gray children could be glimpsed walking in single file, murmuring numbers. 17, 33, 0, 15, though no one could tell what they counted. By mid-morning, Las Cruces was nearly empty. The town had become a husk, left to the winds, the sun, and the Withers children. The sheriff remained as long as he could, leaving detailed notes about the attacks, sketches of footprints, and repeated warnings in case anyone dared return. And somewhere, deep in the soil beneath the ridge, the children waited. they were patient. Because 13 burials had not broken the curse, it had only strengthened it. The survivors of Las Cruces had fled into the barren desert, dragging with them what little they could carry. Families huddled in wagons, in tents, in abandoned homesteads, always moving, always listening. For days, the desert seemed quiet. No wind, no laughter, no scratching. But the silence was a lie. Dreams begin. It began the first night after leaving the town. The survivors fell into a restless sleep, exhaustion claiming their bodies even as dread clutched their minds. One by one, they began to dream. In these dreams, the desert itself became alive. Sand shifted beneath their feet even while awake. But in dreams, it moved with purpose. Pale children emerged from dunes, their faces pale as bone, eyes hollow and gleaming. They whispered in voices like wind across stone, "Return, return, return." The dreams were shared. When survivors awoke, they recounted identical images. The Wither's children, standing in single file across the dunes, counting the stars in the sky, moving through the night toward some unseen destination. Each dream ended the same way. The ground cracked beneath them, and a chorus of whispers urged them down into the earth. Some said they could feel the soil moving beneath their beds, even when awake. Others woke to find tiny handprints etched into dust or sand that had drifted into their temporary camps. The old ritual. Among the survivors was Mrs. Hargrove, a woman steeped in the old stories passed down through generations. She whispered of ancient rituals, of land spirits bound to bloodlines. "The desert remembers," she said. "It holds the children because they belong to it. They are not ours to move. Do you not see? Each burial is a rebellion against what is natural." Some listened, others scoffed. Yet that night, even the skeptics dreamed the same dream. The children standing silently, their mouths moving in a silent litany that echoed inside the skulls of all who slept. A warning in numbers. The dreams carried numbers, always numbers. At first, small, 3, 7, 13. Later, the figures escalated, 21, 33, 47. Survivors began to notice patterns. Every dream contained a number tied to a specific grave or burial date. The desert, the children, the soil itself were counting, keeping track, orchestrating some plan that humans could not understand. Mrs. Hargrove warned, "Do not fight them. Do not rebury them. To resist is to feed their power. To flee is to invite them into your mind." Physical manifestations. Even in the desert, the hauntings were not limited to dreams. Shadows moved in the sand, flickering at the edge of vision. Children's laughter echoed in the wind, rising from dunes, circling wagons, twisting reality with every gust. Survivors reported feeling hands brush against their arms at night, small fingers cold as ice and gritty as soil. One man, Jacob Lenz, disappeared during a night watch. His companions awoke to hear a scream, then silence. The sand where he had stood was disturbed, forming tiny imprints shaped like children's feet. No one ever found him, though they swore his voice joined the chorus of whispers drifting across the dunes. The desert speaks. As the survivors moved deeper into the desert, the environment itself began to betray them. Mirage-like forms appeared on the horizon. Hills of flesh, dunes of bone, horizons that shifted when observed. The heat of day seemed to pulse rhythmically, as if synchronized with the counting of the Wither's children. Nights grew impossibly cold, their lungs frosting in the air as if the desert remembered the blood and soil of the burials. In their dreams, the children spoke of the land itself. "We belong to the soil," they said. "You cannot carry us away." You cannot outrun what remembers survivors began recording everything. Numbers, images, songs hummed in the whispers. They burned logs into the sand to preserve them. Still, the desert seemed to absorb it all. Every mark faded by morning, every message erased. The Wither's children, it seemed, were beyond human comprehension, bound to the desert and the soil, patient as eternity itself. Cliffhanger one night as the survivors camped in a small arroyo, a single voice rose above the chorus of whispers. Distinct, clear, insistent. "Come home." The ground beneath their camp trembled. Sand shifted violently. Lanterns toppled. Shadows stretched unnaturally, merging into shapes that resembled the children, but far larger, grotesquely elongated. The survivors awoke screaming, their wagons overturned, animals dead or missing. And in the distance, atop the highest dune, a line of small gray figures stood, counting silently. 33, 47, 71. The desert was no longer a refuge. It had become a living map of the Wither's curse, marking time, counting, waiting. And the survivors realized they were never truly alone. By mid-October, the survivors of Las Cruces had come to accept a grim reality. The desert itself was alive, bound to the Wither's curse, and there was no simple escape. Nights were dominated by whispers, shadowy shapes, and small hands that reached from the soil to drag at the living. But the days offered no comfort either. The discovery. While scouting ahead for water, Mrs. Hargrove stumbled upon a depression in the desert. A hollow, almost perfectly circular, surrounded by stones carved with indecipherable marks. The earth here pulsed unnaturally, as if breathing. She called the others. Together they examined the hollow. Beneath the top layer of sand, something had been buried, something older than the Wither's children. The men began to dig cautiously, their shovels sinking into soil that seemed wetter than the surrounding desert. As they worked, whispers rose louder, swirling around them like wind through a canyon. The more they unearthed, the more the desert trembled. Ancient rituals. What they uncovered shocked them beyond reason. Beneath the sands lay a shallow pit lined with stone. At its center was a small earthen altar. Symbols, some resembling the numerals the children had whispered in dreams, others entirely alien, were etched deeply into the stone. Charred remnants of herbs and ash suggested this had been used in ritual, possibly to bind or awaken something within the earth. Mrs. Hargrove recognized some of the signs. These were protective sigils, older than any Christian or native rite, designed to hold restless spirits within soil or stone. Someone, had performed these rituals long before the Wither's children were born, binding their fates to the desert. The realization hit them all. The Wither's curse was not a simple haunting. It was layered atop an older power, one that predated the town, predated settlement in the region. Each failed burial, each soil disturbance, had awakened what lay beneath. The first casualty. As the survivors debated what to do, a scream pierced the desert air. It was Jacob Lenz, the man who had vanished weeks ago and returned, shaken from his own dreams. He had wandered too close to the pit and had been grabbed by unseen hands. The sand around him moved violently, small figures clawing at his legs. By the time the others reached him, he was gone, swallowed entirely into the soil. Only his hat remained on the surface. The air smelled of iron and wet clay, a metallic tang that lingered long after the scream faded. Fear escalated into panic. The survivors realized that the Wither's children and whatever spirits were bound beneath the earth could physically interact with the living. They were no longer merely visions in dreams or whispers at night. They were predators, patient and cunning, capable of dragging a man into the desert itself. Partial revelation. Mrs. Hargrove pieced together a grim theory. The Wither's children had been tied to a pre-existing ritual. Their bloodline, she realized, had intersected with ancient desert rites, possibly unknowingly, turning their deaths into anchors for a spirit presence. Each burial, no matter how carefully performed, violated the original magic and strengthened the connection instead of severing it. "This," she said, voice trembling, "was never meant to end. It only grows stronger. Each attempt at rest feeds the spirits beneath. Each number they whisper, it is a tally. We are the witnesses. We are the reckoning signs of escalation. That night, the desert rumbled beneath their camp. Lanterns flickered and died. Shadows stretched unnaturally, merging into elongated forms that resembled the children, twisted and monstrous. The survivors huddled together, chanting prayers, reciting incantations, trying desperately to cling to order and reason. Outside, the soil shifted violently. Small hands emerged, reaching, grasping, eyes, white, hollow, peaked above the dunes, and the whispers grew into a chant. Return, 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 come home, come home, come home. They realized they were surrounded. The Wither's children were no longer confined to the ridge or even the cemetery. They were now an extension of the desert itself. Every dune, every depression, every hollow contained a potential hand, a potential gaze, a potential voice. Cliffhanger. As the survivors gathered near the pit, hoping to perform some counter-ritual or perhaps to flee together, the earth beneath their feet collapsed in a single motion. A small figure rose from the sand, gray, mud-caked, eyes unblinking. Then another. And another. 33 children, or the semblance of them, emerged from the desert floor simultaneously, forming a semicircle around the survivors. The counting began again, echoing across the dunes, harmonized and chilling. 33, 34, 35. The survivors froze, understanding in an instant that the desert was alive. The children were legion, and there was no escape without paying a price. The survivors had no choice but to confront what they had unearthed. The pit, the altar, and the ancient symbols called to them with a magnetic insistence. Each whisper, each step in the desert, pulled them closer. Mrs. Hargrove, trembling but resolute, insisted they attempt a ritual she had only partially deciphered. It was their only chance to contain the spirits, or to die trying. Preparing the site, by midday, the group returned to the pit, carrying with them remnants of old rituals, candles, herbs, stones etched with sigils, and a single volume of archaic chants. The desert was silent, deceptively calm. Not a single breeze stirred the air, but shadows clung unnaturally to the dunes, as if the desert itself were watching. The survivors formed a circle around the altar, arranging candles and stones according to Hargrove's instructions. Each chant, each marking, was precise. One misstep could mean death. Yet, as they began, the ground beneath their feet shivered. Small cracks formed in the sand. The whispers began, soft at first, but steadily growing louder. First contact. Then they saw them. Figures emerged from the desert like smoke congealing into shape. Gray-skinned, mud-streaked, tattered clothing, clinging to fragile frames. But these were no longer merely children. Limbs twisted unnaturally, eyes reflecting the sun like mirrors. The closer they approached, the more the sand seemed to pulse beneath them. The survivors tried to chant louder, to assert their ritual, but the children advanced without sound. Some vanished into shadows only to reappear behind the living. Hands reached through the air, grabbing at hair, scratching skin. One man screamed as a figure clamped its small hands around his neck, leaving bruises in the shape of tiny fingers. The tally. As the ritual progressed, Mrs. Hargrove noticed the children were counting. Not randomly. This was deliberate. Each number corresponded to the graves, the days of burial, the soil disturbed. Their chant was hypnotic, a rhythm that seemed to warp the mind of anyone who listened too long. 17, 33, 47, 71. It was then that the survivors realized the horror of what they faced. These children were not merely bound to the soil, they were its agents. The desert, the pit, the ancient ritual, all conspired to make them eternal. The counting was the pulse of the curse, each number a measure of souls claimed, each tally a promise that it would continue. The first casualty of the ritual. As they attempted to recite the counter chants, the ground erupted. One of the younger men, Elias, was pulled down by unseen hands. Screams echoed across the dunes, lanterns fell and shattered. Dust and sand exploded into the air, obscuring vision. When the survivors could see again, Elias was gone. Only his boots remained, half buried in the sand. The children's laughter rang louder, almost musical, yet grating, dissonant, impossibly layered. Shadows began to stretch and merge, forming grotesque versions of the children. Multiple arms, elongated necks, mouths that opened wider than humanly possible. They encircled the survivors, advancing slowly but inexorably. Mrs. Hargrove's revelation. In a moment of clarity amid chaos, Mrs. Hargrove realized that the ritual on the altar was incomplete. The original binders had not intended the spirits to be destroyed. They had only contained them. To succeed, the survivors would have to accept a bargain. One of them would have to remain as an anchor, bound to the desert, to prevent the spirits from spreading beyond the sands. No one spoke. Each survivor understood the magnitude of the decision. Some whispered prayers. Others sobbed quietly, clutching each other. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath. The counting continued. 83, 84, 85. Escalation and confrontation. The children advanced closer, their gray skin stretching unnaturally with each step. The sand beneath the survivors' feet shifted violently, forming small mounds that rose like hands trying to drag them down. The ritual faltered as panic surged. One survivor screamed, breaking the circle. The children lunged, their motions almost too fast to track. A lantern fell, its flame illuminating the altar and the carvings in the stone. Mrs. Hargrove chanted louder, her voice cracking, trying to assert the ritual's authority. The children froze for a heartbeat. Counting paused at 86. The silence was deafening, broken only by the wind through the dunes, whispering, "Return, return, return." But it was not enough. The ground beneath the altar cracked, small hands bursting from the soil. Shadows merged fully into grotesque forms, far larger than any child. The desert seemed to rise against them. It was no longer merely haunted. It had become an entity, focused, malevolent, and insatiable. Cliffhanger. The survivors realized too late that the only way to save themselves, and perhaps the wider world, was to bind one of their own. Mrs. Hargrove's hand hovered over the altar, eyes wide with dread. The counting resumed. 87, 88, 89. And then the sand erupted beneath her feet. A small gray hand, thin as a snake, shot upward, gripping her ankle. She screamed, flailing, and the desert swallowed her partially. The survivors could only watch as she struggled against the soil, the ritual teetering on the edge of failure. The Wither's children closing in, counting, patient, inevitable. The desert waited. The children counted, and the ritual hung by a thread. The desert had become a living prison. Shadows stretched impossibly long, whispering the relentless counting of the Wither's children. The survivors had gathered around the cracked altar, each heart heavy with exhaustion and fear. The ritual was faltering, the desert pulsing with a hunger that seemed to seep into bone and sinew alike. The grim decision. Mrs. Hargrove, half buried in sand and mud, reached for the ritual volume. Her eyes were wide, frantic, as she realized what the original binders had intended. A single anchor, one living soul, tethered to the desert, to hold the spirits within the soil, preventing them from spreading beyond the sands. The survivors turned on each other. Arguments erupted, cries for mercy, for fairness. Some suggested drawing lots, others demanded volunteers. Every choice carried death or eternal bondage. One man, Thomas, fell to his knees, head bowed, whispering, "It must be me. I can endure it. I can stay." Others shook their heads. The desert pulsed beneath them, counting ever louder. 90, 91, 92. The ground vibrated, small mounds of sand shifting beneath their feet, as if the desert itself urged a decision. The children manifest. Suddenly, the Wither's children advanced. No longer ghostly or fleeting, they had begun to take shape. Gray, mud-caked flesh, elongated limbs, hollow eyes that reflected the sun like mirrors. Their numbers seemed impossible, multiplying from the sand itself. They reached the circle, small hands clutching at ankles, scratching faces, pulling at clothing. One girl leaned forward, whispering directly into a survivor's ear. "You belong here. You belong home," the survivors screamed, but the chanting of Mrs. Hargrove steadied them. She gestured toward the altar. Whoever offered themselves now would anchor the curse, contain it, and perhaps save the rest. Sacrifice and transformation. Thomas stepped forward. He fell to his knees before the altar, hands pressed to the sand, voice trembling as he recited the words Mrs. Hargrove instructed. The desert shivered violently beneath him. The children surrounded him, counting aloud. 93, 94, 95. Then the soil erupted. Hands, pale and gray, dragged him downward. His screams echoed across the desert, mingling with the children's laughter. As he sank into the sand, the desert seemed to absorb him. His body stretched and twisted, merging with the soil, becoming something inhuman. When the survivors approached cautiously, they saw his face partially formed in the mud, eyes hollow, mouth frozen in a silent scream. The ritual completes. Mrs. Hargrove recited the final words, voice hoarse, body trembling. The desert pulsed one last time and fell silent. The Wither's children froze mid-step, their hollow eyes fixed on the anchored figure. One by one, they sank back into the sand, leaving only shallow impressions behind. The counting had stopped. The survivors stood in exhausted silence, staring at the altar and the desert beyond. Thomas, or what had become of him, remained tethered beneath the soil, a living anchor keeping the spirits contained. But the victory felt hollow. Every eye in the group was wide with dread, knowing the desert's patience was infinite. Lingering horror, even as the immediate threat receded, subtle signs of the curse remained. Tiny handprints pressed into the sand around their camp, whispers at night that mimicked voices of children long dead, and the occasional tremor beneath their feet reminded them that the desert and its children were never truly dormant. Mrs. Hargrove warned them, "We have delayed them, nothing more. The desert holds him, but the soil remembers, and the spirits grow stronger with each passing year. They will never sleep." The survivors left the pit behind, dragging their shaken bodies across the dunes. The desert stretched endlessly before them, quiet now, but ominous, filled with the patient, eternal presence of the Wither's children and the anchored soul beneath the altar. Cliffhanger. As they camped that night under a moonless sky, a soft, familiar whisper rose from the dunes. "We will come again. We are patient." Every survivor knew in that instant that Las Cruces was not the end. It had only begun. And somewhere beneath the sands, Thomas's screams, part human, part soil, part curse, would continue forever. The desert silence after the ritual was deceptive. The survivors had escaped immediate danger, yet the land itself seemed to breathe beneath their feet, a slow, deliberate pulse that reminded them of the anchor beneath the soil. Even miles from the pit, whispers echoed faintly in the wind, carrying promises and threats in the same breath. Signs beyond. Las Cruces. As they moved toward the nearest settlements, the survivors noticed subtle, disturbing changes. Crops twisted unnaturally, frost patterns etched across windows in strange geometric forms, and livestock showed signs of agitation, some clawing at the earth as though trying to flee invisible hands. In one small hamlet, the air smelled faintly of iron and wet clay. Children reported seeing pale figures watching from the hills, counting numbers softly under their breath. Adults dismissed it initially, but the pattern repeated, figures appearing in dreams, Numbers whispered in voices that were at once childlike and ancient. Mrs. Hargrove recorded every detail. Her journals, once filled with observations of human behavior, now contained sketches of elongated children, diagrams of dunes, and sequences of counting that seemed to stretch toward infinity. Psychological toll sleep offered no relief. Survivors began experiencing shared dreams again. In these visions, the desert expanded beyond the horizon, the Wither's children walking endlessly, counting, multiplying. The anchored soul of Thomas appeared in glimpses, his face twisted, mouth open in silent screams, a living warning of what awaited if the curse spread. Sleep-deprived, the survivors became paranoid. Shadows moved independently of light. Whispers followed them through streets, and small handprints appeared overnight in soil, ash, and even dust inside homes. Attempts to burn the prints proved futile. The markings reappeared by dawn. First casualties reports reached the survivors of entire families being taken. Not physically, but mentally consumed. One farmer awoke to find his children unresponsive, eyes glazed, whispering numbers in unison. Attempts to shake them from their trance failed. Eventually, the children walked into the desert on their own, disappearing into the dunes with no trace. A traveling merchant described seeing figures rising from the sands like mist, their limbs twisting and merging, chanting numbers in a rhythm that seemed to alter the flow of time. He fled, but the memory remained, etched in his mind as if the desert had imprinted it there permanently. The spread of the curse. Mrs. Hargrove realized the terrifying truth. The curse was not contained to the pit alone. Each burial of the Wither's children had created conduits, linking soil across miles. The anchored soul slowed the process, but it did not stop it. Small towns, hillsides, and even riverbeds could become nodes of corruption, each capable of manifesting the children, counting and drawing souls. The survivors were haunted not just by the presence of the children, but by the inevitability of their expansion. Every dune, every patch of disturbed soil became a potential doorway. The desert, patient and eternal, would continue its work. Moral deterioration. Desperation began to erode cohesion among the survivors. Arguments erupted over whether to return to the pit and attempt a permanent solution, or to abandon hope entirely and flee farther into unknown lands. Fear amplified superstition. Some suggested leaving offerings of blood to appease the spirits. Others proposed burying living children to satisfy the tally. Mrs. Hargrove resisted all such ideas, warning that any interference with the cursed children or the soil would only strengthen the bind. Yet she could not prevent the growing paranoia. Survival had turned into a daily negotiation with fear itself. Cliffhanger one night, under a blood-red moon, a caravan of sand appeared on the horizon. Small gray figures moved in unison, counting in a chant that carried across the desert. 1, 2, 3, 17, 33, 47. The survivors understood instantly. The Wither's children were no longer confined to the pit. The desert had begun to expand its dominion, and as the chanting grew louder, echoing against dunes that seemed to stretch endlessly, one question burned in every mind. Could the anchor hold forever? Or was the desert about to claim more than Las Cruces? The survivors had reached the edge of the desert, but the desert's influence had already crept into their minds, bodies, and the land around them. Every gust of wind carried whispers. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending as though it had its own will. Even the sun above seemed muted, as if filtered through an invisible haze that drained color and warmth. Reinforcing the anchor, Mrs. Hargrove insisted they return to the pit. There was no other choice. The anchor must be reinforced if any hope of delaying the curse remained. The survivors trudged through dunes that seemed endless, their boots sinking into shifting sand, each step leaving faint, hand-shaped depressions. The desert pulsed beneath them, as if counting their movement, tallying their sins and failures. By the time they reached the pit, night had fallen. The moon was a pale sliver, barely illuminating the altar and the shallow depression around it. Shadows moved of their own accord. The Wither's children emerged, dozens of them, their gray forms flickering in the moonlight, eyes hollow, limbs elongating and twisting. Their counting had resumed. 96, 97, 98. The ritual begins. Anew, Mrs. Hargrove arranged the stones and candles again, reciting the incantations with precision. The survivors formed a circle, chanting in unison, each voice trembling but determined. The desert itself seemed to respond, rippling in waves beneath their feet. But the children did not retreat. Instead, they advanced closer, their laughter ringing through the dunes like bells of dread. Shadows merged into grotesque forms, multiple limbs, mouths wide and silent, bodies blending together into nightmarish shapes. The chanting of numbers was hypnotic, affecting the survivors' minds. Some stumbled, their voices faltering, eyes glazing as the rhythm embedded itself in their consciousness. Full manifestation. As the ritual progressed, the desert seemed to fold in on itself. The dunes rose and fell like breathing, the soil shifting to reveal hundreds of pale children, counting in perfect synchrony. One figure, Thomas the anchor, glowed faintly beneath the surface, tethered to the soil but writhing, partially transformed, his mouth open in a scream that echoed across time and space. The survivors felt the full force of the curse. Shadows stretched and coiled around them. Whispers became screams. Small hands tore at clothing, hair, and flesh, but no permanent injury occurred. Instead, the sensation was one of consuming dread, a psychic intrusion that left the mind raw and trembling. Moral and physical collapse. Desperation gripped the group. Some attempted to intervene directly, reaching toward the anchor, trying to stabilize the ritual. Others fell to the ground, hands over their ears, crying aloud to block the counting. The desert seemed to absorb every attempt, reshaping the ritual's energy toward its own ends. Mrs. Hargrove realized a horrifying truth. The anchor could not hold indefinitely. The Wither's children were patient, and the desert eternal. Every chant, every number, every attempt to bind or reinforce was only a temporary reprieve. They had delayed the inevitable, but they could not stop it. Cliffhanger. As the survivors struggled, the children's counting reached a crescendo. 100, 101, 102. The ground erupted around the pit. Shadows surged upward, twisting into grotesque, almost human forms, and the desert itself seemed to lean toward the altar. Mrs. Hargrove screamed as she saw a hand rise from the soil, not small, but enormous, gray, and tipped with nails like blades. The anchored Thomas had partially emerged, his body grotesque, stretching beyond human limits. The Wither's children merged with him, multiplying, counting, and advancing. The survivors understood, with terror burning in their veins, the desert would not be contained. The children, the anchor, the counting, they were unstoppable, eternal. And the final wave was descending upon them. The desert had fully awakened. Shadows now moved independently, carrying the form and voices of the Wither's children across dunes that seemed to stretch infinitely. The anchor beneath the pit, Thomas, had risen partially from the soil, grotesque and inhuman. His body fused with the desert itself. Every step the survivors took seemed futile, each breath laden with whispers of numbers and counting, echoing in their minds like a relentless drum. Pyrrhic victory. Mrs. Hargrove knew there was only one way to survive, though the cost would be unimaginable. With trembling hands, she performed the final incantation, directing the survivors to focus their fear, hope, and voices toward the anchored soul. The earth quaked violently. The Wither's children halted mid-step, their gray forms twitching in place. One by one, the shadows and figures began to sink into the soil, pulled back toward the pit. The desert trembled, resisting. But the ritual held. The counting slowed. 180, 181, 182, until it finally ceased. Silence fell. The wind carried no whispers. The dunes appeared still, but the victory was hollow. Thomas remained fused to the earth, his form grotesque, eternally tethered as the anchor. The survivors had delayed the curse, but they could not undo it. The desert retained its power, patient, eternal, and watchful. Lingering horror. Even as the survivors trudged away, the landscape bore the marks of what had occurred. Small handprints pressed into dunes that would not erode, shadows that flickered unnaturally even under full sun, and the faint echo of numbers whispered on the wind. Children who wandered too close to the desert's edge occasionally fell into trance-like states, their lips moving in silent counting. The survivors knew they could never return. The desert had claimed its anchor, and with it, a fragment of their humanity. Every dune, every hollow, every grain of sand was now a sentinel, waiting, counting, patient beyond comprehension. The final image on the horizon, the pit remained a subtle depression, unassuming to any who did not know its secret. Thomas's form pulsed faintly beneath the surface, gray and twisted, eyes blinking in synchronized unison with the numbers the Wither's children whispered through the soil. The desert was calm, but it was a calm born of vigilance. Mrs. Hargrove wrote the final words in her journal. "We delayed them. We survived. But the desert remembers, and it counts. Every grain, every shadow, every soul. It waits, patient, eternal." A final whisper rose from the dunes. "We will come again. We are patient. We are eternal." The survivors moved onward, but the horror of the Wither's children and the anchored Thomas would never leave them. The desert had not been defeated. It had only begun its long, patient reckoning.